Hello there, and welcome to Wind Down History. I'm glad you found your way here, because tonight we'll be drifting through the life of Cleopatra VII. Wherever you are, let this be your moment to slow down. Let the day soften, the edges blur, and your thoughts settle. She was the last ruler of a 3,000-year-old kingdom, a woman whose intellect shaped the fate of empires. But while many stories focus heavily on the legends of seduction and tragedy, tonight we will simply follow the path of her life, the details, the decisions, and the world as she saw it. Before we settle in, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight. Please let me know in the comments below. It is always fascinating to see how far these quiet stories reach. Now, let's begin. The story begins in Alexandria in the year 69 BC. At this time, the city was the intellectual capital of the world, a place where white marble streets met the deep blue of the Mediterranean. It was a city of scholars, immense libraries, and the famous Pharos lighthouse, which cast its beam far out into the dark waters. In the royal palace, a girl was born into a dynasty that was slowly crumbling under the weight of its own history. This was Cleopatra. She was a Ptolemy, a descendant of the Greek general who had claimed Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. For nearly 300 years, her family had ruled from Alexandria, maintaining a distinct separation from the people they governed. They were Greek in culture, Greek in language, and Greek in spirit. They looked out toward the sea and to Rome, often turning their backs on the ancient Nile that fed their wealth. But Cleopatra was different from the start. While her ancestors were content to speak only Koine Greek, she possessed a hunger for the words of others. She spent her youth immersed in the scrolls of the great library, surrounded by the scent of papyrus and the quiet scratching of quills. Her mind was sharp, disciplined, and vast. History records that she was the first of her line to learn the Egyptian language. It was a decision that signaled a deep shift in perspective. When she spoke to the priests in Memphis or the merchants in the market, she did so in their own tongue, bridging a gap that had existed for centuries. Her education was rigorous. She studied philosophy, rhetoric, and astronomy. She learned to read the stars and to navigate the complexities of international politics. But her most critical lessons came from observing the court of her father, Ptolemy XII, known as the flute player. The palace was a dangerous place, filled with whispers and shifting alliances. The air in the royal chambers was often thick with tension. Cleopatra watched as her father struggled to keep his crown, relying heavily on bribes and the support of the rising power across the sea, Rome. She saw the humiliation he endured to maintain his position, and she noted the treacherous nature of the courtiers who smiled in his presence while plotting in the shadows. This environment forged a steel core within her. She learned early that survival required more than just a royal title. It required an ability to read people, to anticipate betrayal, and to strike before being struck. She understood that power was a fragile thing, easily broken by a careless word or a missed opportunity. As a young woman, she often walked the colonnades of the palace, looking out over the harbour where Roman galleys occasionally docked. She knew that the fate of her dynasty was inextricably linked to that distant republic. While others in the court lost themselves in luxury and excess, Cleopatra was calculating. She was preparing for a role that would demand every ounce of her wit and courage. In 51 BC, the winds of change finally arrived. Her father passed away, leaving the 18-year-old Cleopatra as co-ruler alongside her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII. It was intended to be a joint rule, a partnership to stabilize the kingdom. However, the dynamics of power rarely allow for two suns in the sky. The stage was set for a conflict that would tear the siblings apart and force Cleopatra to make the first of many desperate gambles. The joint rule of Cleopatra and her brother began in name, but in practice, a deep fracture divided the throne from the very first day. Cleopatra was 18, vibrant and fully aware of her capabilities. Ptolemy XIII was a child of 10, easily molded by those who stood behind his chair. And standing there were three men who held the true reins of power in Alexandria: Pothinus, the eunuch who managed the palace; Achilles, the commander of the army; and Theodotus, the rhetoric tutor who shaped the young king's mind. These men looked at Cleopatra and saw a threat. She was not a passive figurehead, content to sign documents they placed before her. She was issuing decrees in her own name and striking coins that bore only her face, ignoring the tradition that required her brother's presence. Pothinus, in particular, recognized that a strong queen meant a weak regency. To maintain his own grip on the treasury and the court, he knew she had to be removed. The atmosphere in the palace shifted from tension to open hostility. Whispers circulated through the corridors, suggesting that Cleopatra was conspiring against her brother. The advisors worked methodically to turn the people of Alexandria against her, blaming a poor harvest and economic struggles entirely on her leadership. It was a classic maneuvering of court politics, where truth mattered far less than perception. By 48 BC, the situation had become untenable. The threat of assassination grew palpable, hanging over her chambers like a storm cloud. Realizing that her time in the capital was at an end, Cleopatra made the difficult decision to flee. She left the marble halls of her birthright and vanished into the harsh expanse of the eastern desert. She made her way to Syria, a region where the authority of the Ptolemies still held some sway. There, she did not resign herself to exile. Instead, she began to gather support, recruiting mercenaries and forming an army of her own. It was a time of immense isolation. The queen, who had studied in the great library, now found herself living in a tent, looking back toward Egypt across the shifting sands. She was an outsider to her own kingdom, waiting for the moment to reclaim what was hers. While Cleopatra waited in the dunes near Pelusium, the great gears of history began to turn violently across the sea. The Roman civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great had reached its climax. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar shattered Pompey's forces, sending the legendary general fleeing in search of sanctuary. Pompey chose Egypt. He remembered the old alliances with Cleopatra's father and hoped for a warm reception. But the advisors of the young King Ptolemy XIII saw only a political calculation. They debated long into the night. If they helped Pompey, they angered Caesar. If they refused him, Pompey might try to conquer them. Theodotus, the tutor, offered a chilling solution. Dead men don't bite. When Pompey's ship arrived in the harbor of Alexandria, he was not greeted with honor. As he stepped into a small boat to be rowed ashore, he was stabbed to death in full view of his wife and children watching from the deck. The young king's advisors believed this brutal act would win them Caesar's favor. They severed Pompey's head and waited for the victor to arrive. Cleopatra watched these events unfold from a distance, her spies bringing news of the chaos. She understood immediately that the balance of power had shifted. Caesar was coming to Alexandria, not as a guest, but as a judge. Her brother's advisors had made a grave error in assuming they could manipulate a Roman general as easily as they did a boy king. The board was set. The Roman legions were approaching, her brother held the capital, and she was stranded in the desert, blocked by the royal army. Cleopatra knew she needed to speak to Caesar before her brother's advisors could poison his mind against her, but entering Alexandria was impossible. Guards were posted at every gate and harbour with orders to kill her on sight. She needed a way in. It was here, on the edge of the desert, that she conceived of a plan that would become legend, a plan that required not an army, but a single trusted friend and a willingness to risk everything on a moment of surprise. When Julius Caesar stepped onto the docks of Alexandria in October of 48 BC, he carried the weight of Rome with him. He was 52 years old, a seasoned general accustomed to order and discipline. What he found in Egypt was chaos. The boy king's advisors presented him with the severed head of Pompey, expecting gratitude. Instead, Caesar turned away in horror and wept. It was a violation of dignity that offended his Roman sensibilities. He immediately established himself in the royal palace, demanding that the warring siblings disband their armies and submit to his arbitration. For Cleopatra, this was the opening she had been waiting for. But the logistics were daunting. She was miles away, and the palace was a fortress surrounded by her brother's soldiers. A direct approach meant certain death. She needed a method of entry that no guard would suspect, a disguise that relied on the invisibility of the mundane. She chose a single confidant for the task, Apollodorus the Sicilian. Under the cover of dusk, they slipped into a small boat and rowed quietly into the great harbour. The water lapped against the hull as they navigated past the massive shapes of anchored Roman galleys. The city lights flickered in the distance, a beacon of both danger and opportunity. When they reached the palace seawall, the real danger began. Cleopatra could not simply walk through the gates. She stretched herself out on a length of coarse bedding. Some accounts say a carpet, others a simple sack used for laundry. Apollodorus carefully rolled the fabric around her, tying the bundle with a leather strap. He hefted the package onto his shoulder, feigning the casual burden of a servant delivering supplies. The walk through the palace corridors was a gauntlet of tension. Apollodorus moved past the sentries with steady nerves, the Queen of Egypt hidden within the folds of cloth on his back. Every step carried the risk of discovery. A suspicious guard or a clumsy stumble would have ended the Ptolemaic dynasty in an instant. They reached Caesar's private chambers. The general was likely working late, reviewing dispatches or planning his next move in a city that felt increasingly hostile. Apollodorus lowered the bundle to the floor and undid the strap. The fabric fell away, and Cleopatra rose. The moment is one of the most famous in history, often painted as a scene of immediate seduction. But the reality was likely more complex. Caesar saw a 21-year-old woman of remarkable courage, someone who had risked execution just for a chance to speak. She was disheveled from the journey, but her composure was absolute. She did not plead, she negotiated. She spoke to him in fluent Greek, engaging him not just as a woman, but as a fellow strategist. They spoke through the night. By the time the sun rose over Alexandria, the political landscape had shifted entirely. The next morning, King Ptolemy XIII arrived for his scheduled audience with Caesar. He expected to find the Roman general alone. Instead, he found his exiled sister sitting comfortably at Caesar's side, already reinstated as queen in the eyes of Rome. The shock was total. The young king, overwhelmed by the betrayal and the sudden collapse of his advisor's plans, tore the diadem from his head and ran screaming into the streets, crying out that he had been betrayed. The palace erupted into confusion. The mob in Alexandria, loyal to the young king and hateful of the Romans, began to riot. Caesar and Cleopatra found themselves trapped within the palace complex, a small island of calm surrounded by a city calling for their blood. The doors were barred, the guards were doubled, and the siege of Alexandria had begun. For the next 6 months, the royal quarter of Alexandria became a gilded cage. Outside the walls, the anger of the city burned hot. The Egyptian army, led by the general Achilles and supported by the anti-Roman faction, laid siege to the palace complex. They cut off the canals that supplied fresh water, forcing the Romans to dig desperate wells into the limestone beneath the palace floors to find drinkable water. The fighting was brutal and close quarters. In a frantic attempt to keep the harbour open for reinforcements, Caesar ordered the burning of the Egyptian fleet docked nearby. The fire, carried by the wind, leaped from the ships to the docks and into the city itself. Tragically, the flames consumed warehouses filled with papyrus scrolls, part of the collection of the Great Library. The accumulated wisdom of centuries turned to ash in an afternoon, a loss Cleopatra likely watched from her balcony with heavy resignation. But while the streets ran with blood and the sky turned black with smoke, a different kind of intensity grew within the palace walls. The war forced Caesar and Cleopatra into a strange domestic proximity. They were isolated from the world, dependent entirely on one another for survival. In the quiet moments between war councils, their relationship deepened from a political pact into a genuine affair. It was a union of equals that Rome would have found impossible to understand. Caesar was accustomed to Roman women who remained in the background, weaving wool and managing households. In Cleopatra, he found a monarch who discussed strategy, logistics, and the divine right of kings. She was not a conquest, she was a sovereign ally. During these long nights of the siege, she became pregnant. It was a development that raised the stakes of the war immeasurably. She was carrying the child of the most powerful man in the Roman world, a child who could theoretically unite the East and the West. Finally, in early 47 BC, reinforcements arrived. A relief army from Pergamon broke through the Egyptian lines, and Caesar marched out to meet them. The subsequent Battle of the Nile was decisive. Ptolemy XIII, fleeing the carnage, drowned in the river, his golden armor weighing him down into the silt. The resistance collapsed. With her brother dead and her rivals defeated, Cleopatra was now the undisputed Queen of Egypt. But rather than immediately turning to governance, she and Caesar took a journey that has puzzled historians ever since. They embarked on a leisure cruise up the Nile. For weeks they travelled south on a massive royal barge, attended by hundreds of servants. They drifted past the ancient temples of the pharaohs, a public display of her power and his protection. It was a statement to the people of Egypt. Their queen was secure, and Rome was her friend. When Caesar finally departed for Rome to quell other rebellions, he left behind 3 Roman legions to ensure order. And he left Cleopatra. Shortly after his departure, she gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy XV, but the world would know him by the name the Alexandrians whispered in the streets: Caesarion, Little Caesar. He was the living proof of the alliance, a boy with the blood of the Ptolemies and the Julii. For Cleopatra, he was the future, a guarantee that Egypt would remain independent. But across the sea, in the Senate House of Rome, the existence of this child was not a cause for celebration. It was a cause for deep, quiet alarm. In the summer of 46 BC, Cleopatra arrived in Rome. She did not come quietly. She brought with her a retinue of slaves, eunuchs, and courtiers, a slice of Alexandrian luxury transported to the banks of the Tiber. With her came her young son, Caesarion, and her brother husband, Ptolemy XIV, a necessary political prop to maintain the fiction of a traditional Egyptian monarchy. Caesar lodged them in his own private villa in the Trastevere district, located across the river from the city centre. It was a sprawling estate surrounded by gardens known as the Horti Caesaris. The location was significant. By placing her there, Caesar kept her just outside the formal boundary of the city, the Pomerium, yet intimately close to his personal life. It was a physical manifestation of her status, an outsider who held the ear of the most powerful man in the Republic. Her presence sent a shockwave through Roman high society. Rome prided itself on a certain austere morality, the idea of mos maiorum, or the way of the ancestors, which valued simplicity, duty, and gravity. Cleopatra represented the opposite. She was unapologetically royal, immensely wealthy, and intellectual. To the conservative senators, she was a dangerous anomaly. The famous orator Cicero, a man who prided himself on his wit and republican principles, visited her in the gardens. He went perhaps out of curiosity, or perhaps hoping for a gift from the famous literary patron. He left feeling humiliated. He later wrote to his friend Atticus, capturing the mood of the Roman elite: "I hate the Queen, and the arrogance she showed me when she was living in the gardens across the river. I cannot recall it without pain." It was not just her personality that rankled, it was what she represented. Caesar was at the height of his power, having been named dictator for 10 years. He was beginning to act less like a magistrate and more like a monarch. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate. He wore high red boots associated with the ancient kings of Alba Longa. And there, in his home, was a foreign queen who had already borne him a son. The fear whispered in the Senate was specific. Would Caesar move the capital to Alexandria? Would he marry this woman and establish a dynasty that would rule over free Romans? Caesar did little to assuage these fears. In a move that shocked the religious sensibilities of the city, he commissioned a golden statue of Cleopatra. He did not place it in a private gallery, but inside the newly built Temple of Venus Genetrix, the temple dedicated to the mythical ancestor of his own family. By doing so, he visually linked the Egyptian queen to the Roman goddess. It was a statement of breathtaking hubris. While the senators grumbled, the Roman public was fascinated. The Egyptian style became a fashion trend. Women began to mimic her pearl jewelry and the distinctive bun of her hair. Cleopatra held court in the villa, engaging with artists, architects, and astronomers. It was during this time that Caesar reformed the Roman calendar, introducing the 365-day year based on the Egyptian solar model, a lasting legacy of the intellectual exchange between the two rulers. But beneath the surface of dinner parties and garden walks, the pressure was building. Cleopatra was living in the eye of a hurricane. She likely saw the graffiti scrawled on the walls of the city, denouncing the king and his queen. She understood the precariousness of her position. Her safety and that of her son depended entirely on the life of one man. As the year 44 BC began, Caesar's ambition seemed to know no bounds. He was declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. He was preparing for a massive military campaign against Parthia, planning to leave Rome for years. For Cleopatra, this meant she would likely return to Egypt as the regent of the East, her position secure. But in the shadows of the stone theatre built by Pompey, a group of men, some friends, some enemies, all calling themselves liberators, were sharpening their knives. They looked across the river at the villa in the gardens and saw the death of their republic. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BC, the villa across the Tiber was likely quiet. Cleopatra was preparing for a departure of her own, or perhaps planning to wave farewell to Caesar as he left for his Parthian campaign 3 days later. The city of Rome felt steady, turning on the axis of the dictator's authority. But by midday, the atmosphere shattered. Cleopatra did not see the knives in the Senate house. She did not see the 23 stab wounds or the body of the man she loved lying at the foot of Pompey's statue. Instead, the news came to her as a wave of panic rolling outward from the Forum. Messengers arrived breathless, bringing fragmented reports. Caesar was dead. The Senate was in uproar. Gladiators were gathering. The liberators, Brutus, Cassius, and their co-conspirators were marching through the streets with blood on their hands, proclaiming liberty. For Cleopatra, the grief was instant, but it was quickly overtaken by a cold, terrifying clarity. She was now the most vulnerable person in Rome. The protection that had shielded her from the xenophobia of the mob and the hatred of the conservatives had vanished in a single afternoon. She was a foreign queen in a city that had just murdered its own leader to prevent a monarchy. Her son, Caesarion, was the only living son of the dictator. To the conspirators, the boy was a loose thread. To the mob, he was a symbol. She waited in the villa as the sun set over a city teetering on the edge of civil war. The streets were dangerous, filled with rioters, burning the houses of the conspirators and soldiers unsure of who commanded them. History does not record exactly when she left, but the window for escape was closing rapidly. Within weeks, she organized her household. There were no grand processions this time, no golden statues or public displays. The departure was hasty and tense. She boarded her ships at Ostia, looking back at a coastline that had promised her an empire and given her only a tragedy. The dream of uniting the Mediterranean under a single dynasty was dead. The journey back to Alexandria was somber. She returned not as the partner of the world's most powerful man, but as a widow with a target on her back. Yet, the woman who stepped off the ship in Egypt was harder than the one who had left. She had seen the brutality of Roman politics up close, and she understood that survival required absolute control. Upon her return, the loose ends of her own dynasty were tied up with ruthless efficiency. Her brother-husband, Ptolemy XIV, the last obstacle to her sole rule, died shortly after their arrival. The cause was recorded as sickness, but the timing suggests the hand of the queen. She could not afford a rival, however weak. In his place, she elevated her son. She named the 3-year-old Caesarion as her co-ruler, King Ptolemy XV. On the walls of the Temple of Dendera, she commissioned massive reliefs depicting herself and the boy as divine figures. She was Isis, he was Horus. It was a declaration to the world. Her son was not a Roman bastard to be hidden away. He was a king, a god, and the rightful heir to the legacy of Caesar. While Rome descended into chaos, with Mark Antony and Octavian hunting down the assassins, Cleopatra secured her borders. She rebuilt her fleet. She opened the granaries to feed her people during a famine and navigated the treacherous economic fallout of the war. She watched the horizon, knowing that eventually the storm in Rome would turn east again. She would be ready. She was no longer just the daughter of the flute player or the mistress of Caesar. She was the independent queen of the East, and she would force Rome to treat her as an equal once more. The year was 41 BC. The dust from the civil wars had settled, leaving the Roman world divided between two men. In the west, the young, cold calculator Octavian consolidated his power. In the east, the charismatic soldier Mark Antony ruled like a king. Antony was a man of immense appetites for war, for wine, and for adoration. He was setting up his headquarters in Tarsus in modern-day Turkey, and he summoned the monarchs of the East to pledge their loyalty. Among them, he called for the Queen of Egypt. He wanted to question her allegiance during the war, but more importantly, he needed the wealth of the Nile to fund his coming campaigns against Parthia. Cleopatra received the summons, but she did not rush to obey. She understood the psychology of Mark Antony perfectly. He was not Caesar. Caesar had been a man of the mind, swayed by intellect and strategy. Antony was a man of the senses, a lover of spectacle who saw himself as the living embodiment of Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry. To approach him as a subordinate would be a mistake. She needed to appear as a vision. She delayed her journey, letting Antony's messengers wait, building an air of anticipation. When she finally sailed for Tarsus, she did not dock in the harbour like a common vassal. She ordered her fleet to sail up the Cydnus River, straight into the heart of the city. The scene she orchestrated was a masterpiece of political theatre. As the royal barge drifted up the river, the crowds in Tarsus abandoned the marketplace to stare in wonder. The ship was a spectacle of excess. The hull was plated with gold, shimmering in the afternoon sun. The sails were dyed Tyrian purple, a colour more precious than silver, swelling in the breeze. The oars were made of silver, and they dipped into the water to the rhythm of flutes, pipes, and harps, played by hidden musicians. Cleopatra herself lay beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed not as a Roman matron, nor even entirely as a queen, but as the goddess Aphrodite. Boys dressed as Cupids fanned her, while her most beautiful handmaidens, dressed as Nereids and Graces, steered the rudder and handled the ropes. Heavy, expensive perfumes wafted from the ship, drifting over the riverbanks and into the city. The scent arrived before the queen did, announcing her presence to the senses before she was even seen. Mark Antony was left alone on his tribunal in the market square as the entire population flocked to the riverbank. The word spread like wildfire. Aphrodite had come to revel with Dionysus for the good of Asia. When they finally met, the dynamic had been completely reversed. She was not a queen answering a summons. She was a goddess granting a visitation. When Antony invited her to dinner, she politely declined, and instead insisted he dine with her. He accepted. The banquet she hosted that night was legendary. The lights, the food, the gifts given to his officers. It was a display of wealth so casual and so vast that it left the Romans stunned. Antony, a man who prided himself on his own grandeur, found himself completely outmatched. He was enchanted, not just by her beauty, but by her sheer audacity. In that single evening at Tarsus, Cleopatra secured her throne and her safety. She offered Antony exactly what he craved: magic, validation, and the resources of Egypt. In return, she gained the sword of the strongest general in Rome. It was the beginning of a partnership that would consume the rest of their lives. A union formed not in whispers, but in a blinding flash of gold and purple. Mark Antony followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria, leaving his legions and his responsibilities waiting in the provinces. For the winter of 41 to 40 BC, the world paused. The Roman general and the Egyptian queen shut the gates of the palace and created a universe entirely their own. They formed a club, a sort of exclusive circle they called the Amimetobioi, the Society of Inimitable Livers. The name was a challenge to the gods themselves. The members were dedicated to a life of absolute excess, where every meal was a feast and every day brought a new invention in pleasure. Ancient historians describe a schedule of banquets so lavish that cooks would roast 8 boars simultaneously, starting them at different times just to ensure that one was perfectly cooked the moment Antony requested his dinner. But this was not merely about food or wine. It was a contest of wit and imagination. Cleopatra knew that Antony could not be held by beauty alone. He needed to be entertained, surprised, and challenged. One famous story from this winter illustrates the scale of their game. In response to a wager that she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal, Cleopatra removed one of her earrings, a pearl of immense size and value. She dropped it into a cup of strong vinegar. As Antony watched, the gem dissolved into a clouded sludge. She lifted the cup and drank the fortune in a single swallow. Whether the story is entirely fact or partly legend, it captures the essence of their bond. Wealth was not something to be hoarded, but a toy to be used for the moment. Their relationship extended beyond the banquet halls. They roamed the streets of Alexandria at night, dressed as common servants. They would knock on doors, peek into windows, and banter with the locals, who often recognized the giant Roman and the sharp-tongued woman, but played along with the joke. The Alexandrians grew fond of Antony, saying that he wore his tragic mask for the Romans, but kept his comic mask for them. Yet, beneath the laughter and the wine, a deep political alliance was solidifying. Cleopatra was binding Antony to her with chains of shared experience. She needed him to see Egypt not as a province to be plundered, but as a home to be protected. She showed him the wealth of her kingdom, the efficiency of her bureaucracy, and the power of her fleet. Antony, for his part, found in Cleopatra a woman who could match his voracious energy. She hunted with him, drank with him, and played dice with him. She was the only person who did not fear him. In the isolation of the palace, they became indispensable to one another. But the outside world could not be ignored forever. In the spring of 40 BC, the reality of the empire crashed through the doors of the palace. Messengers arrived with disastrous news. In the east, the Parthian Empire had launched a massive invasion, overrunning Syria and Judea. In the west, Antony's own wife, Fulvia, and his brother had started a civil war against Octavian in Italy, a war they were losing badly. The inimitable life was over. Antony, shaken from his stupor, realized the precariousness of his position. He had to leave. He said a hurried goodbye to the Queen, boarded his ships, and sailed to confront the chaos consuming his territories. Cleopatra watched him go, uncertain if she would ever see him again. She remained in Alexandria, pregnant with his twins, left to govern alone once more. The winter of excess had passed, and a long, silent chill was about to set in. For 3 years, from 40 to 37 BC, the connection between Alexandria and Rome went dark. Cleopatra remained in her capital, governing a kingdom that was thriving economically but politically isolated. Shortly after Antony's departure, she gave birth to twins, a boy, Alexander Helios, and a girl, Cleopatra Selene, names meaning sun and moon. They were the children of the new Dionysus and the new Isis, born into a world where their father was merely a rumour from across the sea. While Cleopatra raised the twins and managed the Nile floods, news from Italy arrived in fragmented, painful reports. Mark Antony had not only reconciled with Octavian, he had sealed the alliance with a marriage. His new bride was Octavia, the sister of Octavian. The reports described Octavia as the perfect Roman woman, virtuous, loyal, and beautiful in a quiet, traditional way. She was everything Cleopatra was not. She was the peace weaver, the woman who would keep the two warlords from tearing the world apart. For Cleopatra, this was a profound betrayal. It was not just a matter of jealousy, though the sting of being replaced was sharp. It was a diplomatic disaster. She had gambled her throne on Antony's protection, and now he was legally bound to the family of her greatest rival. Yet the Queen of Egypt did not collapse. She turned her focus inward. During these silent years, she demonstrated her brilliance as an administrator. She reformed the coinage, managed the grain supply to avoid famine during low floods, and secured the loyalty of her subjects. She ruled alone, as she had always done, proving that her power was not dependent on a Roman consort. But she kept her eyes on the east. She knew that Antony's ambition could not be contained by a domestic life in Rome. He dreamed of conquering Parthia, of equaling the glory of Alexander the Great, and for that he needed gold. He needed ships. He needed Egypt. So she waited. She raised his children in the luxury of the palace, constant reminders of the bond that still existed. She knew that eventually the call of the campaign would be louder than the comfort of his Roman marriage. The silence was long, but it was not permanent. It was merely a pause before the final act. The silence finally broke in 37 BC. Antony, preparing for his long-delayed invasion of Parthia, summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Antioch. This time, she brought the twins he had never seen. The reunion was intense and immediate. They picked up exactly where they had left off, but the stakes had changed. Antony publicly acknowledged the children as his own, giving them Roman names to legitimize their status. He also granted Cleopatra vast swathes of territory, parts of Syria, Lebanon, and Judea. But the true turning point, the moment that made war with Rome inevitable, came 3 years later, in 34 BC. Antony returned to Alexandria after a campaign in Armenia. He staged a Roman triumph, a sacred procession usually reserved for the streets of Rome, right there on the wide boulevards of the Egyptian capital. The procession ended at the Gymnasium, a massive public square. There, on a silver platform, sat 2 golden thrones. On one sat Antony. On the other sat Cleopatra, dressed in the full regalia of the goddess Isis. Below them, on smaller thrones, sat their children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, and Caesarion, now a young man. What followed is known to history as the Donations of Alexandria. It was a piece of political theatre so audacious that it still stuns historians today. In a loud, clear voice, Antony began to carve up the Roman East. He declared Cleopatra the Queen of Kings. To her sons he gave kingdoms: Armenia, Media, and Parthia to Alexander, Syria and Cilicia to Ptolemy. He was distributing Roman provinces as if they were personal gifts. But the most dangerous declaration was saved for the end. Antony formally proclaimed that Caesarion was the true legitimate son of Julius Caesar. This was a direct spear thrust at Octavian. Octavian's entire claim to power rested on his adoption by Caesar. By elevating Caesarion, the biological son, Antony was calling Octavian a usurper. He was saying that the true heir to Rome sat on an Egyptian throne. The crowd in Alexandria cheered. They saw the restoration of their ancient glory, a new empire rising from the Nile. But across the sea, the news landed with the weight of a declaration of war. When reports of the ceremony reached Rome, the Senate was apoplectic. They heard that a Roman general was wearing Eastern robes, giving away Roman land, and bowing to a foreign queen. The donations were meant to secure a dynasty. Instead, they handed Octavian the perfect weapon. He no longer had to fight a civil war against a popular general. He could now claim he was fighting a crusade against a foreign sorceress who had enslaved a Roman mind. The path to the end was now open. In Rome, the reaction to the donations of Alexandria was slow, deliberate, and poisonous. Octavian, now 30 years old and master of the Western Mediterranean, understood that he could not simply declare war on Mark Antony. Antony was still a Roman hero, a former consul, and a man with deep loyalties among the legions. To attack him directly would look like another grab for power by a young tyrant. So Octavian found a different target. He turned his gaze toward the east and pointed a finger not at his rival, but at the woman standing beside him. He launched one of the most vicious propaganda campaigns in history. In the marketplace, in the Senate, and in the verses of poets, a single narrative began to take root. Antony was not a traitor. He was a victim. He had been drugged, bewitched, and enslaved by a foreign sorceress. Octavian painted Cleopatra not as a queen, but as a monster, a decadent, dangerous Eastern harlot who sought to impose the rule of strange animal-headed gods upon the capital. The rumors grew wilder with every retelling. It was whispered that she used love potions to cloud Antony's mind. It was said that she planned to rule Rome itself and administer justice from the steps of the capital. The Roman people, weary of civil war, found it easier to hate a foreign queen than to face the reality of another brother against brother conflict. But words were not enough. Octavian needed proof of Antony's total submission. In 32 BC, he committed an act of shocking sacrilege to get it. He marched into the Temple of Vesta, the most sacred sanctuary in Rome, and seized Antony's will from the hands of the Vestal virgins. He read the document aloud to a stunned Senate. In it, Antony confirmed that Caesarion was Caesar's heir. He listed the massive gifts of land to Cleopatra's children. But the line that sealed his fate was his final request. Even if he died in Rome, his body was to be transported through the Forum and shipped to Alexandria, to be buried beside Cleopatra. The Senate exploded in outrage. To a Roman, the desire to be buried abroad was the ultimate rejection of one's citizenship. It was proof that Antony's soul had already defected. The political maneuvering that followed was masterful. Octavian did not declare war on Antony. He declared war solely on Cleopatra. By doing so, he stripped Antony of his legal status. Any Roman who fought for him was now fighting for a foreign enemy against their own home. In the east, Cleopatra and Antony understood that the time for diplomacy had passed. They moved their massive headquarters to Ephesus, gathering a fleet that eclipsed anything the world had ever seen. They had 500 warships, tens of thousands of soldiers, and a war chest filled with Egyptian gold. Yet, as the winter of 32 BC approached, the mood in their camp was fraught with tension. The Roman officers in Antony's staff were uncomfortable. They resented receiving orders from an Egyptian queen. Several high-ranking generals defected to Octavian, unable to stomach the optics of the war. Cleopatra fought to maintain her position. She argued that since she was paying for the war, she would be present for it. She refused to be sent back to Egypt to wait. It was a decision born of pride and necessity, but it played perfectly into Octavian's narrative. Every day she stood by Antony's side in the camp, she validated the claim that she was the true commander, and he was merely her general. The trap was set, and the world held its breath as the fleets turned toward Greece. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, the water in the Gulf of Ambracia was calm, but the air was heavy with stagnation. For months, Antony and Cleopatra's forces had been trapped. Octavian's brilliant admiral, Agrippa, had cut off their supply lines, blocking the exits to the open sea. Malaria was ravaging their camp, and desertion was bleeding their army dry. The decision was made not to fight for victory, but to fight for an escape. The plan was desperate. They would load the war chests onto the transport ships, burn the rest of the fleet, and use their heaviest galleys to punch a hole through Agrippa's blockade, allowing Cleopatra's squadron to slip through and run for Egypt. At noon, the wind shifted. The massive fleets collided. The battle itself was a chaotic grinding of timber and iron. Octavian's smaller, faster Liburnian ships swarmed Antony's floating fortresses, unable to ram them but raining down arrows and firepots from a distance. The sea churned with debris and the smoke of burning pitch obscuring the horizon. Then, in the midst of the gridlock, a signal flag was raised. Cleopatra, watching from the rear, saw a gap open in the center of the line. She gave the order. Her 60 ships raised their sails, an odd sight in a battle usually fought with oars, and caught the north wind. They surged forward, cutting straight through the combat, ignoring the dying men in the water, and raced for the open sea. It was a brilliant tactical maneuver to save the treasury, but it triggered a psychological collapse. Mark Antony, fighting on his flagship, looked up and saw the purple sails of the Queen's ship disappearing over the horizon. In that moment, the general vanished, and only the lover remained. He did something that no Roman commander had ever done. He abandoned his flagship. He jumped into a small, fast quinquereme with only 2 companions and ordered them to follow her. He left behind 19 legions. He left behind brave men who were currently dying for his cause, men who would continue to fight until nightfall, refusing to believe their leader had fled. When Antony finally caught up to Cleopatra's flagship, he did not go to her. He was hauled aboard, broken. He walked past the Queen without a word and went straight to the prow of the ship. There he sat alone, his head in his hands, staring into the dark water. The journey back to North Africa took 3 days. For 3 days, the most famous couple in the world sailed on the same vessel, separated by a wall of silence. Cleopatra remained in her stern cabin, surrounded by her ladies, calculating the cost of their survival. Antony remained at the prow, paralyzed by the shame of his instinct. The Battle of Actium was over. It was not ended by a sword, but by a sail. The war for the world had been decided, and the long, slow drift toward the end had begun. The year that followed the return from Actium was defined by a suffocating sense of finality. Alexandria was still beautiful, its lighthouse still cutting through the night, but the energy of the city had curdled. The Society of Inimitable Livers, with its feasts and practical jokes, was formally disbanded. In its place, Cleopatra and Antony formed a new, darker fraternity, the Synepothenomenoi, or the Companions in Death. The members of this new circle were the same friends and courtiers who had revelled with them in Tarsus and Ephesus, but the mood had shifted entirely. They still dined together, and the wine still flowed, but the conversation was no longer about the future. It was a mutual pact. They swore to die together rather than face the humiliation of a Roman triumph. While Antony retreated into a deep, paralyzing depression, Cleopatra remained frantic with activity. She was not ready to submit to the role of a tragic victim. She looked for a door that hadn't yet closed. She conceived an audacious plan to escape the Mediterranean entirely. She ordered her remaining fleet to be dragged overland, across the desert isthmus that separated the Mediterranean from the Red Sea. Her goal was to load her treasury and her children onto these ships and sail for India, far beyond the reach of Rome. It was a logistical nightmare, requiring thousands of men and immense will, but for a few weeks it seemed possible. Then the final betrayal arrived. The Nabatean Arabs, sensing the change in the political wind and likely bribed by Roman agents, attacked the shipyard on the Red Sea coast. They burned the vessels before they could even touch the water. Cleopatra stood in Alexandria and watched her last hope turn to ash. The message was clear. There was no way out. The world was closing in. One by one, the pillars of their power collapsed. Herod of Judea, a man who had owed his throne to Antony, travelled to Rhodes to meet Octavian. He placed his crown at the conqueror's feet and offered his loyalty to the new master of the world. In Libya, the 4 legions Antony had stationed there to protect Egypt refused to take his orders. The general Pinarius Scarpus executed Antony's messengers rather than let them speak. Antony's reaction to this cascade of abandonment was to withdraw completely. He built a small dwelling on a pier extending out into the great harbour, cutting himself off from the palace and the queen. He called it the Timonium, naming it after Timon of Athens, the famous misanthrope who hated mankind. There he lived in isolation, brooding over his failures, refusing to see the woman who was trying to save their children. Cleopatra, however, used this time for a grim kind of research. History records that she began to visit the royal prisons. She tested various poisons on condemned criminals, observing the effects with a scholar's eye. She was not looking for cruelty. She was looking for a specific kind of mercy. She wanted to know which death was the quickest, the most painless, and the least disfiguring. She rejected the violent convulsions caused by strychnine and the lingering agony of slow toxins. She was searching for a sleep from which one simply did not wake. It was a chilling practicality. She was preparing her exit strategy, ensuring that when the moment came, she would retain her dignity to the very last breath. As the spring of 30 BC arrived, the Roman legions appeared on the horizon. Octavian approached from the east, marching through Syria, while his generals closed in from the west. The circle was complete. There were no more maneuvers, no more negotiations, and no more ships. The gates of Alexandria were barred, but inside the palace, the decision had already been made. On the 1st of August, 30 BC, the silence of Alexandria was broken by the tramp of boots. Octavian's legions had reached the hippodrome just outside the eastern gates. The end was no longer a concept, it was a physical presence outside the walls. Mark Antony, shaken from his stupor in the Timonium, decided to meet it with a flash of his old self. He donned his armor and led a small cavalry force out of the gates. In a surprising turn, he routed Octavian's advance guard, chasing them back to their camp. He returned to the palace triumphant, smelling of sweat and dust. He found Cleopatra and embraced her, presenting the soldier who had fought bravest beside him. Cleopatra, playing her part in this tragic theatre, gave the soldier a golden helmet and breastplate. That night, the soldier took his golden gifts and defected to Octavian. It was a brutal reminder that heroism had no currency in a lost war. The next morning, Antony prepared for a final battle on land and sea. He marched his infantry out of the city gates and watched from a high hill as his fleet rode out to meet the enemy. He expected a clash of rams and iron. Instead, he saw his ships raise their oars in a salute. Octavian's ships returned the greeting. The two fleets merged, turning together to aim their prows at the city. Simultaneously, his cavalry deserted. Antony was left standing on the hill with nothing but his sword and his rage. He rode back to the city screaming that Cleopatra had betrayed him. Terrified by his fury, Cleopatra fled the palace. She took refuge in the massive 2-story mausoleum she had been building for herself near the Temple of Isis. She sealed the heavy stone doors, locking herself inside with her two most loyal handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, and her vast treasure of gold, pearls, and ivory. From behind the stone walls, she sent a message to Antony. The content was a lie, calculated and final. She told him she was dead. Why she did this remains one of history's dark questions. Was it to protect herself from his anger? Or was it a final act of love, a way to encourage him to take the honorable Roman exit that would save him from humiliation? Antony received the news in his quarters. The rage evaporated, replaced by a dull, heavy acceptance. He unbuckled his armor, speaking to the silence of the room. "Why do you delay longer, Antony?" he asked himself. "Fate has taken away the only thing that made you hold on to life." He called for his faithful servant, Eros. Years before, Eros had sworn an oath to kill his master if the end ever came. Antony handed him the sword and demanded the fulfillment of the promise. Eros took the blade, raised it, and then turned it inward, stabbing himself through the heart. He fell dead at Antony's feet. Antony looked down at the body. "Well done, Eros," he said. "You could not do it, but you have taught me what I must do." He drove his own sword into his belly, but the blow was not immediately fatal. He collapsed on the couch, bleeding and begging the servants to finish him. They fled the room in terror. For some time, the master of the Roman East lay alone, writhing in agony. Eventually, a messenger arrived from the mausoleum. Cleopatra, hearing the commotion, realized the truth. She was not dead, and he was dying. She begged for him to be brought to her. The scene that followed is one of the most visceral in the ancient world. The doors of the mausoleum could not be opened once the mechanism had caught. The only entry was a high window on the upper floor. Cleopatra and her 2 women lowered ropes from the window. Antony's servants tied him to the lines. Then the Queen of Egypt, a woman accustomed to being carried in litters, began to pull. It was a gruesome, desperate struggle. Plutarch describes Cleopatra straining at the ropes, her face distorted by exertion, her hair wild, while Antony swung helplessly against the stone wall, his blood smearing the white limestone. The women below wept and pushed. The women above pulled until their hands were raw. Finally, they heaved him over the sill and onto the floor. Cleopatra tore her clothes in grief, beating her chest and covering his face with kisses, wiping the blood with her own robes. In those final moments, the politics, the wars, and the empires faded. Antony asked for a cup of wine. He drank, and he urged her to save herself if she could do so with honor. He died in her arms. The sun was setting over Alexandria, and for the first time in her life, Cleopatra was truly, utterly alone. The sword was broken. Now only the final negotiation remained. With Antony dead, the silence of the mausoleum became a prison. Cleopatra was no longer a queen negotiating a treaty. She was a prize to be secured. Octavian had strict orders for his men. Cleopatra must not be allowed to die. A dead queen was a tragedy, but a living queen, walking in chains through the streets of Rome behind his chariot, was a symbol of total victory. The capture was swift and undignified. While officers distracted her at the heavy iron doors, a Roman general named Proculeius scaled a ladder and climbed through the same high window where Antony had been hoisted up. He rushed down the stairs and seized her from behind just as she drew a small dagger from her robes. The blade was knocked away, and her clothes were shaken to ensure she concealed no poison. The Queen of Kings was now a captive of the Roman state. She was allowed to return to the palace, but she was kept under constant guard. Her spirit seemed broken. She stopped eating, hoping that illness would finish what the dagger could not. Her body, once celebrated for its vitality, grew frail and feverish, but Octavian knew her weakness. He sent a message threatening the safety of her children if she did not eat. The mother overruled the queen, and she accepted food. A few days later, the encounter the world had waited for finally took place. Octavian came to visit her in her chambers. The contrast between them was stark. Octavian was 33, cold, sickly, and utterly composed. Cleopatra was 39, mourning, disheveled, and desperate. Ancient sources describe the room as heavy with tension. Cleopatra attempted one final performance. She threw herself at his feet, invoking the memory of Julius Caesar, showing him letters the great dictator had written to her, trying to spark some familial pity in his adopted son. She spoke of her wealth, offering him gifts, trying to buy her safety with gold. Octavian's response was chilling in its politeness. He did not mock her, nor did he offer comfort. He simply listened, keeping his face like a mask. When she finished, he assured her that she would be treated with gentleness and humanity. He advised her to be of good cheer and left. It was a masterclass in ambiguity. Octavian believed he had pacified her, that the promise of life had lulled her into submission. But Cleopatra had spent 2 decades navigating the treacherous currents of power. She recognized the tone of a man lying. She knew that gentleness was a euphemism for captivity. Her suspicions were confirmed by a young Roman officer named Cornelius Dolabella. Perhaps he was moved by her charisma, or perhaps he simply pitied the ruin of such a legend. he sent a secret message to her chambers, delivering the hard truth that Octavian would not say. The message was brief. He prepares to return to Syria, and within 3 days you and your children will be sent away to Rome. The veil was lifted. She was not going to remain in Egypt as a client queen. She was to be the centerpiece of Octavian's triumph. She would be paraded before the jeering mobs of the Forum, a living trophy of Rome's conquest over the Eastern menace. The knowledge brought a sudden, strange calm. The uncertainty was gone. She now knew exactly how much time she had left. She asked Octavian for one final favor: permission to visit Antony's tomb to pour libations and say farewell. Octavian, confident that she was preparing for the journey to Rome, granted the request. She went to the tomb and wept, embracing the coffin. But when she returned to the palace, she did not go to pack her trunks. She ordered a bath. She dressed in her finest royal robes, putting on the diadem of the Ptolemies one last time. She ordered a lavish meal to be served. The time for negotiation was over. The time for the final act had arrived. The sun was high over Alexandria when a peasant arrived at the palace gates. He carried a basket covered with leaves, claiming it contained figs for the queen. The guards, suspicious of everyone and everything, stopped him. The man simply smiled and lifted the leaves, showing the large, ripe fruit underneath. He even offered one to the sentries. Seeing nothing but a simple gift, they waved him through. They did not see what lay coiled beneath the fruit. Inside the royal chambers, the atmosphere was one of quiet, terrifying purpose. Cleopatra finished her meal and wrote a final letter. She handed it to a guard, ordering him to deliver it immediately to Octavian. Then she commanded everyone to leave the room, except for her 2 most loyal companions, Iris and Charmian. The heavy doors clicked shut. The guards outside stood their watch, unaware that the letter they carried was a diversion intended to buy the queen a few precious minutes of privacy. When Octavian opened the scroll and read the first line, a plea to be buried beside Antony, he understood instantly. He had been outmaneuvered. He jumped from his chair and ordered his men to run to the queen's quarters. He stayed behind, perhaps hoping that his soldiers might arrive in time to apply an antidote, or perhaps simply accepting that the game was over. The soldiers sprinted through the palace corridors, bursting through the doors of the royal apartment. They were too late. The scene they found was a tableau of perfect, tragic stillness. Cleopatra lay on a golden couch, dressed in her full imperial regalia. She was dead. Iris lay dying at her feet. Charmian, weak and trembling from the poison she had also taken, was standing at the head of the couch, carefully adjusting the diadem on her mistress's brow. One of the Roman soldiers, furious at the loss of his prize, shouted at the woman, "Charmian, was this well done?" Charmian turned to him, her voice failing but her dignity intact. "Extremely well," she whispered, "and befitting the descendant of so many kings." With those words, she fell dead beside her queen. History does not record exactly what happened in those final moments behind the closed doors. The legend says she allowed an asp, an Egyptian cobra, the symbol of divine royalty, to bite her arm or her breast. Others suggest she carried a hollow hairpin filled with a potent toxin. But the method mattered less than the meaning. In death, she had escaped the chains of Rome. She had denied Octavian his triumph and asserted her sovereignty one last time. Octavian, arriving shortly after, stared at the body of his enemy. Though he was denied the satisfaction of parading her through Rome, he could not help but admire the sheer will of her exit. he ordered that she be buried with royal honours, placing her to rest beside Mark Antony, just as she had asked. The dynasty of the Ptolemies was finished. The independent kingdom of Egypt became a Roman province. But as the tomb was sealed and the sand began to drift over the tracks of the legions, the story of the Scholar Queen, the lover, and the goddess refused to fade. It simply settled into the silence, waiting to be remembered.